This hockey game between the Montreal Canadiens and Russia's Red Army has been called the greatest game ever played. Hi, I'm Rebecca Brayton and welcome to WatchMojo.com. And today we'll be learning more about the New Year's Eve Classic of 1975. The book delves into the backstory of the Soviets and the Montreal Canadiens and the years leading up to this game. So tell us about that time.
This game took place 3 years after the 1972 Summit Series. And even before then, there had been a gradual recognition of the threat of the Soviet Union to Canada's role as the all-consuming power in the hockey world. This game was the culmination of a lot of that. And it represented the first time that you had the Montreal Canadiens, the most successful team in the NHL, versus the Central Red Army, the most successful team in the Russian League. And this was their first meeting, so there was a lot of hype going into the game. And it was one of those rare moments where the hype was surpassed by the actual events of the game.
Shot with Cornwall, Mahoney, shot, shoots, goal!
Can you give us some historical context about the political atmosphere at this time?
Beyond hockey, this game also took place during the Cold War, which was, us versus them, East versus West, democracy versus communism. A whole lot of political, cultural, societal factors went into this game that went beyond the rink. It was very important for both countries, much less both teams. And the Canadiens that night were a team that represented Canada, not just the Montreal Canadiens.
And there over the rise now, he shoots at the rebound inside of the net.
Tell us about some of the players who took part in this game.
The game featured a veritable who's who of the Hockey Hall of Fame. Just alone, even on the Canadiens, you had Ken Dryden, Larry Robinson, Serge Savard, Guy Lapointe, Guy Lafleur, Jacques Lemaire, Steve Shutt, Yvon Cornwall, Bob Gainey, all in the Hockey Hall of Fame. It's like an all-star team that we'd never see today. And the Russians had the great Vladislav Tretiak and Valery Harlamov, and they were basically as well the Russian national team. So it was a true best-on-best competition.
Mikhailov takes his shot. He scores! Mikhailov fired it. Dryden got a piece of it, and it went in.
Is there anyone who stood out?
On the Russian side, Tretiak would clearly be, he was the first star of the game. And clearly he was the main reason the game was a tie and not perhaps a Canadiens' victory. In the research for the book, Scotty Bowman told me that Tretiak's performance that night was as good a game as he'd ever seen anybody play in goal, which is pretty high praise. And he was undoubtedly the first star of the night, and it's really his night. And as Dick Irvin said, that game more than anything else probably put him in the Hockey Hall of Fame.
Now Mahovlich getting into Cornwall, getting ready for the net, and a splendid save by Tretiak.
Now, tell us about gameplay, the game itself. What happened in the game?
The game itself was such a huge event. Television, of course, beamed it to Canada, and it was the first game actually carried live in the Soviet Union at 3 in the morning. The game ended in a 3-3 tie, and for all those who suggest that the Canadiens should have won, it's interesting to note that with a couple of minutes left to go in the game, with the game tied, that the Red Army actually hits the post behind Dryden, so the Canadiens could easily have lost that game.
The light doesn't go on, and it's the goal post.
And there was a real sense that if the Canadiens had lost that game, somehow there was a part of hockey in this country that had been lost, to the point that I was told by Dick Irvin that if the Canadiens had lost that game, there was a plan for them to actually bring Roger Doucette, the anthem singer, back out at the end of the game to sing "O Canada" again.
Here's Cornwall to Lafleur. He rips the shot just wide. Puck loose in front of the net. Cornwall scores!
Why is this called the greatest game ever played?
Obviously, the term is a very debatable point. What may be my greatest game may not be yours. But that game, in the 35 years since it's been played, has been held up as the standard. When people talk about the greatest game, they talk about December 31st, 1975. The game had it all. It had politics. It had the spectacle. It was just one of those rare one-off events that, transcended sports, but also exceeded the hype and expectation that had come before.
Petrov is coming down to the Canadiens line. He's in over the line. Harlamov going in, he scores! Beautiful setup!
Would you say we'll ever see another game this significant?
Today, when we have a Canada-Russia game, the game is a big deal, of course, but then they go back and play for their NHL teams, and some of the Russian players are teammates with the Canadian players. It just doesn't quite have that us versus them mentality anymore that it used to. And I think it would be hard to recreate that, given that all the best players, as I said, play in the NHL.
Shukov over the line. There's the pass, Alexandria. He scores!
Would you say that we see lasting effects of this game on the NHL today?
In that game conclusively proved, even after the events of 72, that Vladislav Tretiak was one of the greatest goalies in the world, that Valery Harlamov was one of the greatest forwards, and led to what we had for the next 2 decades, which was a wealth of Canada Cups, Challenge Cups, all these best-on-best competitions, until the late 80s, when the Soviet players finally started joining the NHL. And today you have a league where all the best players play in the NHL, whether they're Russian, Finnish, Swedish, and you have a real global NHL. And I think you can trace that back to that evening on December 31st.
It looks like it's going to end at 3, 1 second left. The game is over, and the Soviets and the Canadiens tie at 3.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.